Welcome to Context. This is Brad Harris. Today, we're turning our attention to one of the most talented historical thinkers of our generation and his acclaimed book about the origins of modern globalization. Charles Mann's 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created. At the end of the episode, I've also included an interview with Charles Mann himself for those of you who support the podcast on Patreon. So, if you're interested in bonus content like today's interview with the author, Charles Mann, the website, bradharris.com, has all the links you need to get on board. What led to the rise of the modern world? What is it that has enabled some societies to make so much progress while others have languished? In particular, how did Europeans and their descendants abroad manage to exert such disproportionate historical influence in recent centuries after lagging behind for so long? These are questions worth dwelling on, not to glorify the West, but to understand how much control we really have over our fate. Countless historians have tackled these questions, but many of their books, as we've seen, settle the issue in one of two ways. Some claim that the recent dominance of Western civilization is merely an accident of history, the result of luck or the environment. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel exemplified this by explaining the uneven fates of human societies in terms of the uneven environmental resources at their disposal. On the other hand, other historians argue that Western power was no accident at all, and was instead the historical consequence of unique values and institutions. David Landy's book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, for example, highlighted Northwest Europe's exceptional enthusiasm for novelty and its unrivaled respect for private property as necessary ingredients for the Industrial Revolution, while Margaret Jacob, in her book Scientific Culture and the Making of the Industrial West, revealed how Britain became one of the wealthiest countries in history in large part by making the pursuit of knowledge itself profitable. Now, both of these two historical frameworks are valuable, but it's rare to encounter an author who succeeds in integrating each of them, the historical power of accident and purpose, into a single narrative. Charles Mann is an exception. He accomplishes this in a grand historical synthesis of modernity that revolves around the rise of global exchange. 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created, published in 2011. Mann's book is nothing short of epic. After reading 1493, it's hard to see the world in quite the same way ever again. What makes Mann such a compelling big-picture thinker is that, as a science journalist, he has a unique ability to assimilate the insights of countless specialists in multiple fields, from history and archaeology to ecology and epidemiology, and cohere them into a dynamic, interconnected story about why things are the way they are. An ecologist like Jared Diamond might look at the world and see how the environment constrains civilizational development. An economic historian like David Landy's looks at the same world and sees how private property rights incentivize innovation. Charles Mann appears to see all of that and more. And by fusing such a wide array of specialists' perspectives, Mann helps us see how Europeans emerged at the center of a modern globalized world based on unprecedented systems of exchange that they did create on purpose and that they did direct in part, but that ended up being so much bigger than any of them could comprehend and that had consequences none of them could imagine. Quote, "The ships that sailed across the Atlantic carried not only human beings, but plants and animals, and also less familiar organisms like insects, grasses, bacteria, and viruses, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. After Columbus, ecosystems that had been separate for eons suddenly met and mixed in a process that historian Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was neither fully controlled nor understood by its participants, but it allowed Europeans to transform much of the world into ecological versions of Europe." Another way might be to say that Columbus's voyage did not mark the discovery of a new world, but its creation. How that world was created is the subject of this book." End quote. Like many of us, Charles Mann grew up seeing textbook illustrations of Christopher Columbus disembarking on the shores of America in 1492 after having triumphantly sailed the ocean blue. The drawings most of us were educationally weaned on showed a meeting of estranged people and little else. But Mann realized that many more significant travelers, hidden from view, flooded into the New World in that critical moment. Columbus and those who followed him were transplanting entire chunks of European ecology with them, from pigs and horses and bees, which they brought on purpose, to rats, cockroaches, and a dozen lethal diseases, which they brought inadvertently. The collision between strands of humanity separated for tens of thousands of years was dramatic enough, but it incurred a far more disruptive collision between strands of biology separated for tens of millions of years. Quote, "Newspapers usually describe globalization in purely economic terms, but it is also a biological phenomenon. Indeed, from a long-term perspective, it may be primarily a biological phenomenon. After 1492, the world's ecosystems collided and mixed as European vessels carried thousands of species to new homes across the oceans. The Columbian Exchange is the reason there are tomatoes in Italy, oranges in the United States, chocolates in Switzerland, and chili peppers in Thailand. To ecologists, the Columbian Exchange is arguably the most important event since the death of the dinosaurs." End quote. With the ecological stakes so high, it's little wonder that Europeans had no idea they were pushing the initial domino, as it were, of a historical chain that would reshape the planet. But they did push that domino on purpose in the first place, and at tremendous personal risk and expense. Why? Before Columbus's voyage, the eastern and western hemispheres were entirely cut off from each other, and like China and Europe prior to Genghis Khan, practically no one on either side of the earth knew of the other side's existence. After Genghis Khan's imperial conquests across the eastern hemisphere in the 1200s, the civilizations and ecologies there were connected, and leading up to Columbus's voyage, Europe was tantalized by the trickle of trade goods that filtered through Islamic merchants from China. Europe was awakened to the stark reality that it was poor and primitive compared to China. And once connected, Europe's appetite for Chinese silks, spices, porcelain, and other novelties was like the appetite of a child discovering sugar, only increasing as it suckled and leaving Europeans high on a rush of commercial speculation. At the same time, Christian Europeans considered the Islamic merchants from whom they were forced to buy Chinese goods as nothing more than heretical middlemen. They loathed doing business with Muslims, almost as much as they resented the extortionate prices Muslims could charge as long as they monopolized Chinese overland trade. For 200 years, this grievance percolated, driving Europeans to desperate measures in search of alternative ways of tapping Asian commerce. The Portuguese took an early lead, outfitting ever more advanced vessels to sail ever farther down the west coast of Africa in search of a sea route east. By 1445, they'd reached the coast of Senegal on Africa's westernmost land bulge. A year later, they were skirting Sierra Leone, and by the 1470s, the Portuguese were dipping into the southern hemisphere. Only in 1488, barely 4 years before Columbus would reach America, did the Portuguese succeed in rounding the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa and finally head east toward China. But by then, Columbus was already preparing to head west in an attempt to leapfrog past the Portuguese and secure a European monopoly on Chinese trade for Spain. Contrary to a stubborn historical myth, everyone knew the world was round in Columbus's day. And it wasn't the allure of Chinese goods only that enticed the Spanish monarchy to fund Columbus's westward scheme. As Charles Mann documents, Columbus ultimately convinced Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand to back him by highlighting that, quote, trade with China would pour so much money into Spain that in 3 years the monarchs would be able to set about preparing for the conquest of the Holy Land. End quote. Above everything else, then, Columbus's trip was an attempt to circumvent and financially overpower the Islamic world by securing Europe's direct access to the riches of China once and for all. And long after he and those who followed him encountered the unknown continents of North and South America that stood in their way, Europeans continued to reach for China, perennially assuming its harbors were awaiting them just around the river bend. Right through the founding of the Jamestown colony of Virginia by the English in 1607, tapping the resources of the Americas was never the focus of Europe's plan, nor were the countless other consequences of their ignorance of this other half of the world. Nearly a century passed after Columbus's landfall in Hispaniola in the Caribbean before any Europeans actually accomplished the goal of establishing oceanic trade with China. In the meantime, however, the Columbian Exchange that Columbus had unknowingly set into motion radically altered the ecology of the Western Hemisphere, wiped out tens of millions of Native Americans, and caused a 200-year-long cold snap across the world that scientists have come to identify as the Little Ice Age. As Mann clarifies the connections between this otherwise baffling cascade of consequences, he reiterates that, quote, creatures the colonists knew nothing about hitchhiked along for the ride. Earthworms, mosquitoes, cockroaches, honeybees, dandelions, and African grasses, rats of every description, all of them poured from the hulls of Columbus's vessels and those that followed, rushing like eager tourists into lands that had never seen their like before. Natives and newcomers interacted in unexpected ways, creating biological bedlam. End quote. The tsunami of invasive species that crashed upon the shores of the Americas was disruptive enough, but the biggest consequence of the Columbian Exchange came with the smallest of the European hitchhikers. Quote, before Columbus, none of the epidemic diseases common in Europe and Asia had existed in the Americas. Shipped across the ocean from Europe, these maladies consumed Hispaniola's native population with stunning rapacity. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, novel microorganisms spread across the Americas, ricocheting from victim to victim, killing 3/4 or more of the people in the hemisphere. It was as if the suffering these diseases had caused in Eurasia over the past millennia were concentrated into the span of decades. End quote. Native American civilizations from the Andes of South America to the Mississippi Valley of North America had been home to some of the most populous societies in the world prior to the Columbian Exchange. And contrary to modern fantasies that Native Americans lived primitively in a pristine wilderness, in fact, they sustained their massive populations by massively re-engineering nature. One of their principal tactics was to set forest fires. For thousands of years, Native American societies from California to Maine regularly burned thousands of square miles to clear land for farming, drive out insects, and sweep away undergrowth, converting vast stretches of otherwise dense, scrubby forest into open parkland, lush with tender growth that attracted wild game for hunting. Forest fires were like nature's shower, and Native Americans cleaned their continents with flames on a scale far larger than any forest fire we worry about today. Prior to Europeans' arrival, much of the eastern half of the future United States, for example, was wide-open parkland, a game hunter's paradise, dotted here and there with large, shade-giving trees and carpeted with soft, verdant grasses. Mann provides an excellent historical map of this in his book, which he created with the help of the National Geographic Society. After European contact, all of this changed in the biological blink of an eye, triggering an environmental transformation so dramatic that it affected weather all over the world. As Mann puts it, quote, "Enter now the Columbian Exchange. Eurasian bacteria, viruses, and parasites sweep through the Americas, killing huge numbers of people and unraveling the millennia-old network of human intervention. Flames subside to embers across the Western Hemisphere as Indian torches are stilled. Indigenous pyromania had long pumped carbon dioxide into the air. Now, the pump suddenly grows feeble. Formerly open grasslands fill with forest, a frenzy of photosynthesis. Forests regenerate across swaths of North America, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and Amazonia. The destruction of Native American societies by European epidemics both decreased native burning and increased tree growth. Each subtracted carbon dioxide from the air." End quote. A frenzy of photosynthesis indeed. It was like the Earth suddenly took a huge breath, sucking billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and infusing its carbon into billions of new trees that rushed to fill the gaps. Scientists and historians have long known that between the 1400s and the 1700s, global temperatures dipped way below normal, creating a veritable mini ice age that allowed children to ice skate on the Thames River in London and along the canals of Amsterdam, heaved new glaciers onto farms in Switzerland, and doomed the nascent Norse settlement of Greenland. As Mann documents, a consensus is now growing that European contact, which caused upwards of 90% of Native Americans to die from disease, which caused the ancient regimen of American forest fires to end, caused the Little Ice Age. In just over a century, between 1550 and 1650, the eastern seaboard of the United States metamorphosized from a parkland of scattered trees to a forest so dense that English colonists in the 1700s joked that a squirrel could travel from Maine to Florida without ever touching the ground. Europeans just assumed that the dark, impenetrable forest they encountered in America was primeval, ancient, a timeless wilderness. In fact, it was brand new, the recent ruins of something ancient. The death of so many Native Americans, the transformation of the ecology of the Western Hemisphere, the Little Ice Age, these were facets of the Columbian Exchange that Europeans could not understand and did not control. They represent the accidents of history that favored some, in this case the Europeans who colonized the Americas, and that caused others to suffer, principally the Native Americans. But a part of the Columbian Exchange that Europeans did mostly understand and control was the extraction and cultivation of new resources in the Americas, and, more significantly, their integration into a new global system of trade. And this, in turn, enabled Europe to transition from being one of the poorest to one of the richest regions of the world. Quote, "Nothing like this worldwide exchange had existed before, still less sprung up so quickly or functioned so continuously. No previous trade networks included both of the globe's two hemispheres, nor had they operated on a scale large enough to disrupt societies on opposite sides of the planet." End quote. As always, Mann reminds us, China was a key player in many Europeans' strategy. After Spanish conquistadors had brutally subdued and looted the Aztec and Incan civilizations of Central and South America in the early 1500s, Spanish prospectors canvassed the countryside for more precious metals to ship abroad. In 1545, Mann surmised they, quote, "discovered something as close to a mountain of silver as geology allows, Potosi in southern Bolivia, an absolutely enormous silver strike, by far the largest one in history, that roughly doubled the supply of silver in the world in the course of 100 years." End quote. By the early 1600s, Potosi, a once remote mountain village isolated at some 15,000 feet above sea level, became the biggest boom town in the world. The Spanish monarchy, which seemed always to be at war with everyone, demanded that the deluge of silver from Potosi's mines flow directly to Spain in order to pay for all of its wars and finance its chronic debts. To move 150,000 tons of silver, historians' rough estimate for the amount extracted through Potosi's heyday from the mountains of western South America, 2 Spanish ships in the Atlantic, thousands of llamas and mules bore 2 or 3 ingots of silver at a time, weighing 60 pounds apiece, hundreds of miles down the mountains to the Pacific coast, where ships were loaded nearly to submersion to sail the silver north to Panama. There, mules took up the glistening cargo once again to carry it across the isthmus to Spanish ports on the Caribbean coast, where the main Spanish treasure fleet awaited. That was how things were supposed to go. But a big fraction, Mann estimates up to half, of South American silver never crossed to the Atlantic side at all. Instead, it was diverted across the Pacific Ocean to China, where Spanish rogues found far greater profits on offer. By the 1570s, Spanish smugglers had set up a thriving trading post with China in modern-day Manila in the Philippines. Although technically illicit, silver sales to China represented a huge commercial breakthrough for Europeans, from whom the Chinese had previously been uninterested in buying anything. The Chinese considered their products superior to those of Europe virtually across the board, and we wouldn't blame them. The most common item Europeans had attempted to sell was wool. Suitable for chilly Europe, perhaps, but an itchy nuisance in warmer China, where a far more comfortable textile abounded: silk. With silver, on the other hand, Mann writes, quote, "Spain finally had something China wanted, badly wanted, in fact. Spanish silver literally became China's money supply." End quote. Within a decade of the first load of Spanish silver reaching Manila, China was dispatching at least 20 large merchant ships a year to meet them and snatch up as much silver as possible. Europeans, long dismissed by China, suddenly found themselves showered with the best Asian goods available. Quote, "Chinese merchants crammed aboard each ship with every imaginable commodity, silk and porcelain, of course, but also cotton, iron, sugar, flour, chestnuts, oranges, live poultry, jam, ivory, gems, gunpowder, lacquerware, tables and chairs, cattle and horses, and whatever else the Chinese thought Europeans might want." End quote. Silver was the great catalyst of the Columbian Exchange. Global trade was supercharged, and European economies, now at the center of a new age of international commerce, blossomed with the most diverse spectrum of goods in the world. Moreover, once the commercial door to China had been opened, Europeans soon managed to sell as many goods to China as they purchased, especially new kinds of foods from their colonies. Likewise affected by the Little Ice Age, China's weather patterns in the late 1500s and early 1600s changed, punishing some of its most productive farmland with record cold and rainfall. Thousands of acres of rice paddies washed away, and, quote, "famine shadowed the rains. Poor Chinese families were reduced to eating bark, grass, and insects." End quote. Intermittent famine had plagued China for centuries, but the chronic crop disasters of the 15 and 1600s caused by the climate shift compelled Chinese culture to finally open itself up to new foods imported from abroad, especially those native to the Americas. Quote, "From this perspective, the Columbian Exchange was a boon, and China raced to embrace it. No large group of the human race in the Old World was quicker to adopt American food plants than the Chinese. Sweet potatoes, maize, peanuts, tobacco, chili peppers, pineapple, cashew, manioc, all poured into China." End quote. Sweet potatoes from the Andes Mountains in South America flourished on Chinese land previously assumed barren, and China transitioned from starving to supporting probably the largest population explosion in history. As Mann reports, historians estimate that China's population had grown slowly for centuries, reaching about 150 million by 1600. But with the spread of sweet potatoes, it doubled to 300 million by the end of the 1700s. The initial boon, however, was relatively short-lived and soon overshadowed by dire environmental consequences, which persist to this day. Since sweet potatoes could be grown across vast stretches of China's dry uplands, millions of new farmers moved into these formerly vacant areas and began clear-cutting trees to support intensive crop cultivation. It was a shock to China's environment without precedent, and dealt a blow to the ancient empire serious enough to tilt the entire balance of world power westward. Quote, "The result was a wave of deforestation, followed by waves of erosion and floods, which caused many deaths. The Chinese regime, already straining under many problems, was further destabilized, to Europe's benefit." End quote. China had originally embraced the Columbian Exchange in order to preserve its unrivaled historical might. But unlike the relatively small but nimble European states that greatly benefited from the opening of the world, the sudden influx of foreign influence destabilized China's massive political weight, leaving it teetering for centuries to come. Thereafter, there were no world powers big enough to check European expansion. On the other side of the world, meanwhile, the Columbian Exchange continued to favor the growth of European power and influence. Mann's account of these developments is densely detailed. The book is 720 pages long, after all, but the history of one commodity in particular, tobacco, characterizes the interconnected forces of exchange over which Europeans had only limited awareness or control. Sometime in the mid-16 teens, English colonists in the ragged settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, imported tobacco from Spanish colonies in South America in a desperate attempt to salvage their situation. From its founding in 1607, Jamestown had existed on the brink of annihilation, but the Virginia Company kept sinking huge amounts of money and people into the venture in hopes of turning a profit. Once the initial goal of establishing for England an economical sea route to China failed, the colony experimented with dozens of other ventures, from winemaking and shipbuilding to salt panning and glass blowing. Mann documents that more than 100 shiploads of colonists and supplies were sent to Jamestown within its first 2 decades, and that, quote, "year after year, most of the would-be settlers perished within weeks or months. Out of some 7,000 people sent to Virginia between 1607 and 1624, 8 out of 10 died." End quote. But then, Virginians tried their hand at cultivating tobacco, and everything changed. Tobacco exports enabled the Virginia Company to finance its huge debts, and by the late 1620s, tobacco was making the Jamestown colony profitable. By 1660, the Chesapeake Bay was earning a worldwide reputation as the Tobacco Coast, shipping 25 million pounds of dried tobacco overseas to Europe each year. Europeans and Chinese alike couldn't get enough of the addictive plant, and tobacco farmers in the New World were growing rich. More than anything else, tobacco initiated American immigration. Quote, "Newcomers poured in, grabbed some land, and planted tobacco. The English transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. Tobacco from South America was far from the only biological import. The English brought along all the other species they were accustomed to finding on their farms back in Europe." pigs, goats, cattle, horses. It became harder and harder for surviving Native Americans to prosper there. Meanwhile, it was easier and easier for Europeans to thrive in an environment that their own actions were making increasingly familiar. End quote. One thing about the region of the future United States south of the Mason-Dixon line, where tobacco and other labor-intensive crops grew best, that wasn't so familiar to Europeans, however, was the relatively warm, wet climate. And there, once all the tobacco growing attracted a critical mass of immigrants, an ancient parasite of the Old World found a bountiful home in the New. Quote, "Tobacco brought malaria to Virginia, indirectly but ineluctably, and from there it spread until much of North America was in its grip." End quote. The cascade of consequences continued. With such intense tobacco demand, European farmers grew desperate for labor to cultivate, cut, and cure the plant, and initially they imported indentured European servants, usually young men from poor families in England whose passage to America and initial settlement were financed in exchange for 7 years of farm work. North of the Mason-Dixon line, this arrangement worked well enough, but south of it, where warmer weather made malaria thrive, that economic arrangement failed. After paying for their passage, Southern tobacco farmers found that too many of their European laborers were falling ill and dying from the disease. In fact, of all the people swept up in the Columbian Exchange, the only ones who seemed largely immune from the plague were Africans being sold into slavery. In contrast to Europeans, Mann describes, African kings had for centuries tended to view labor rather than land as their most valuable source of wealth, and rival African kingdoms had established profitable traditions of capturing their enemies and selling them as slaves to merchants operating throughout the Indian Ocean and Middle East. Slavery thrived through the medieval and early modern era in these regions, while in Europe, most people shunned slavery as an uneconomical, if not immoral, system. In the context of the Columbian Exchange, however, malaria changed their minds. Quote, "Inherited malaria resistance occurs in many parts of the world, but the peoples of West and Central Africa have more than anyone else and are less susceptible to malaria than anyone else on Earth. About 97% of the people in West and Central Africa are immune to malaria. Slavery and malaria thrived together." End quote. This is where biology enters history, Mann emphasizes. It's impossible to say whether or not America's darkest moral stain would have ever set in absent malaria and other diseases like yellow fever to which Africans were resilient. But Mann makes it clear that Africans' immunological superiority was the biggest contributing factor. Looking at another revealing map that Mann provides, there is indeed a clear historical correlation between the geographical prevalence of the diseases to which Africans were immune and the regions of their enslavement. Both scourges occupied the zone between the Mason-Dixon line in North America and the southern border of Brazil in South America. After humming along mostly as a regional affair for centuries, African slavery was, in large part, pulled into the wider world by the parasites that flowed through the Columbian Exchange. Given the overwhelming calamity of slavery, it's easy to understand why so many people have condemned the Columbian Exchange as a net historical negative. Its legacy of globalism likewise appears to many people around the world today as an unwelcome, albeit far less brutal form of commercial oppression. 1493 does not so much contradict these moral instincts as complicate the culpability of globalization's pioneers. And given how vast and interconnected the Columbian Exchange proved to be, its tragic consequences are at least somewhat counterbalanced by Mann's copious documentation of its fruits. He shows how the Columbian Exchange also introduced potatoes into Europe in the 1600s, saving millions of people there from famine and malnourishment. How it led international merchants to discover mountains of guano, nitrogen-rich bird excrement, on islands off the coast of Peru, which they harvested by the ton and exported across the world as high-intensity fertilizer to revolutionize global food production. How the Columbian Exchange introduced Europeans to rubber, one of the critical inputs for the Industrial Revolution, and how it connected malaria doctors across the Atlantic with anti-malarial quinine from cinchona trees in the Andes. The list goes on. Uncovering the new world Columbus created is a monumental task, even for a mind as multidisciplinary as Mann's. The Columbian Exchange, created but by no means controlled by Europeans, catapulted Europe from poverty to power by placing it at the center of modern globalization. And as catastrophic and oppressive as the emergent system proved to be, it also liberated hundreds of millions of people around the world from the ancient grip of provincial privation. Societies that opened themselves to the potential of global exchange occasionally suffered as a result, but those that closed themselves off from it almost always did. As Mann admits, quote, "It is unsettling to think of globalization's long record of ecological convulsion and the suffering and political mayhem caused by that convulsion. But there is grandeur, too, in this view of our past. It reminds us that every place has played a part in the human story, and that all are embedded in the larger, inconceivably complex progress of life on this planet." End quote. Amid the complexity of interacting historical forces Charles Mann elucidates in 1493, one force in particular seems so significant as to demand deeper consideration. It played a central role, too, in Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And of all the historical challenges that have undermined humanity's control over its own fate, disease must be at the top of the list. The history of disease is gruesome, but its revelations of humanity's resilience are also deeply fascinating. Next time on Context, we'll dive into the renowned historian William McNeill's groundbreaking classic on the subject, Plagues and Peoples. I'm Brad Harris. So long.